Okay, as we are convening today, the situation in Israel's south, as you know, is heating up. Over 150 rockets have been fired at Israel's southern communities since Friday. More than 30 rockets alone have pounded Israel's southern region just today, with one Grad rocket reaching as far as Beersheba. We are aware at this time that retaliatory raids from Israel have killed at least 11 top Hamas terrorists that we know of. On top of that, this morning, Israel received an incoming missile in the Golan Heights this morning. And, of course, after the horrible and tragic kidnapping and murder of Naftali Frankel, Eyal Yafrach, and Gilad Shaer, which had profoundly moved every Israeli citizen and Jews throughout the world, 6 Israeli Jews have been arrested for the brutal and senseless murder of Mohammed Abu Khader. This, of course, has been condemned by Prime Minister Netanyahu. I should say here that as opposed to Palestinian society, Israel is a nation that abhors and totally rejects this sort of behavior rather than lionizing it. It's a society that's based on the rule of law, and I can tell you without a doubt that these 6 youngsters have been apprehended and will be severely punished. However, in response to the senseless act of revenge, Israeli Arabs have been rioting for several days in East Jerusalem and some Israeli Arab towns in the north. We've also seen that some Israeli bedouins have been jumping into the fray. I'm honored today to have here with us to discuss this developing situation Dan Diker. Dan is the former Secretary General of the World Jewish Congress, an umbrella group representing Jewish communities and organizations in nearly 100 countries around the world. He is currently a research fellow at the Institute for Counterterrorism in Herzliya and a foreign policy fellow at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. Dan received his BA from Harvard cum laude and his MA in Government and Counterterrorism Policy from the Interdisciplinary Center of Herzliya, summa cum laude. Without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce you to Dan Diker. Dan?
Thank you very much, Sarah. Thank you, everybody, for joining the call. And shalom from Jerusalem to everybody in what is one of the most complex sets of political and geostrategic, diplomatic, and security conditions that I can remember in the quarter century that I have lived and worked in this country. And I would assume that all of you are aware of this very complicated puzzle that we have here in front of us. I would like you to know one thing as we get rolling into this. What I want to keep as a brief briefing, and then engage as much discussion and questions as we can in this phone format. First of all, Israel is facing a number of very important and critical national security challenges. There have been tens of mortars that continue to be fired at this time from the Gaza Strip, as well as Sarah said, a number of rockets that have been fired there, including a rocket from the north. Hamas in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria continues to hide the 2 terrorists that killed the 3 Israeli teens, and there is a concern, a serious concern, that these 2 individuals, under the sanction of the Kawasme family in Hebron, will try to carry out more kidnapping terror attacks, knowing that their days are numbered, and that's created a lot of tension on the eastern side of Israel. We are facing a very serious development in the substantial violence in a number of Israeli Arab towns from Jerusalem all the way through the north, and this comes amidst what is no less than national anguish over this horrific murder of Mohammed Abu Khader, an innocent 15-year-old Arab boy who lives in Jerusalem, is a resident of Jerusalem. His families are residents from Jerusalem, who, according to the suspicions of the police, was murdered in just a horrific, vicious attack by 6 youth. Now, it's important that we understand that these youths right now are suspects. One of them has confessed to connection to this murder, and it may be that the others are on their way to doing the same. However, there has not been a conviction. Has not yet gone to court. Nonetheless, there has been a wall-to-wall condemnation in Israel from every political party, from the prime minister down. The prime minister spoke with Hussein Kadir's father of Muhammad this morning, and many of the ministers are going over to his home in Shuafat to visit with the family, as expected in such a situation. But I'd like you to know the national anguish that has taken place over this terrorist murder, apparently by youths who are, some of them 14 and 15 years old. This was, I spoke to a senior police official on just 48 hours ago, and their view here is that Israel has not known any planned organizational infrastructure in Israel among any Jews that would be capable of carrying out such thing as an organized infrastructure, as an organized crime. It apparently these young, crazed, almost child terrorists are the exception to what the Jewish state has ever known, and I think there is a sense of national shame from the political left to the political right over such a horrific act that has been completely condemned as being anti-Jewish, against all values of the state of Israel, all values of Judaism, all values of the Zionist movement, and has really been vomited out. Now this is a very complex, creates a complex background to these other 4 national security problems. And it also, because of what I would call a dangerous comparison between the kidnapping murder by the Hamas terror organization of the 3 Israeli teens, and the dangerous comparison with this via a false moral equivalence that we see in some of the even in some of the mainstream media in the West. And by the way, I would say that Israel has been so enormously self-critical, and correctly so, about this murder, but the press has taken a very aggressive self-critical lead, and I think has resulted in a type of false moral equivalence that would even implicitly or explicitly compare the Hamas to the state of Israel, meaning the Hamas committed a kidnapping murder, Israel committing a kidnapping murder. But there is a world of difference between these two horrific acts on both sides. Number one, the state of Israel will take the harshest measures against the perpetrators of this act. The Prime Minister and practically the entire cabinet has offered their services and their help and assistance to this family. And let's remember, these kids represent absolutely no one and are not even on the fringes of Israeli society. They're outside the fringes of Israeli society. Clearly, we have a situation in which the Hamas continues today, as we speak, to incite and to encourage and incite to murder and kidnap Israelis, which Prime Minister Ismail Haniyeh did in his separation, in his goodbye speech in the Gaza Strip following the reconciliation agreements. And it's important, I think, that we understand that the Hamas commands somewhere between 35 and 45% of Palestinian public opinion today. They are a partner to the reconciliation pact between Fatah and the Hamas government, and it's important to note that while they deny formally the kidnapping, they've done everything in the past to publicly, you can find it on YouTube, publicly encourage and celebrate this particular terrorist atrocity. You might notice in some of the YouTubes groups of Palestinian youth holding up the number 3 regarding the 3 kidnapped and murdered teens. And it's clear that for Israel, what has happened here with this terrible atrocity against Muhammad Abu Khadir is something like the Newtown, Connecticut school murders or the Denver movie house murders. And at the same time, Israel looks, and it should be seen, that the Hamas atrocity is more like America's 9/11 in terms of the political goals behind, the political direction, the political goals behind this type of atrocity. So we want to create a real clear separation as to what Israel as a free, democratic a society of law and order is doing in order to prosecute these terrorist criminals and not to fall towards false moral equivalency comparisons between the two. Now, having said that, the reason there is a major debate within the Israeli cabinet in this hour, 12:20 Eastern Standard Time, 7:20 in Israel, as to what Israel is going to do, if anything, right now in the Gaza Strip. It is uncharacteristic for Prime Minister Netanyahu, for those who have followed his past policymaking, to appear to be so hesitant about sending the Israeli army into Gaza in order to launch a counter-terror campaign against the 10,000 rockets that are in the possession of the Hamas, 3,000 rockets in the possession of the Islamic Jihad, which is the other major competition to Hamas hegemony in the Gaza Strip, as well as hundreds of rockets, somewhere between 500 and 600, 700 rockets in the hands of other Salafist organizations. What is the debate in the government about? There is a major concern on the part of Mr. Netanyahu, Defense Minister Ya'alon, and he is joined by Finance Minister Lapid on this point, that if Israel launches an operation, a major ground operation, that operation would keep Israel in the Gaza Strip for many months, even up to a year. Those are the assessments that I've heard as recently as this morning. The situation, because of the situation of the murder of the Arab teen, the sensitivities are so great throughout Israel, as well as in the West Bank, as well as the situation in Gaza, that it's possible that such a counter-terror operation, in order to destroy the terror infrastructure of the Hamas from the ground, similar to what Israel did in the defense, in the what's called a Mudanan, which was the pillar of defense operation in November 2012, might trigger a massive igniting of violence and terror on 3 to 4 fronts. Of course, the front which has already been ignited in southern Israel, in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, as well as Arab cities throughout Israel. Israel cannot be in that situation where it is fighting on 3 fronts within and just on the borders of its own state. And the fourth possible front is the outer ring, which would essentially be reflected by additional jihadi activity a little bit further from Israel's borders. But we see that ISIS, the ISIS, the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, has been making substantial progress in Iraq and Syria. With Hezbollah in Lebanon, it might well ignite very serious jihadi terrorist activity on those 3 fronts. And there is a concern here that with all of the efforts the United States is making in its efforts, its counter-terror efforts in those areas, not with boots on the ground, but through other efforts, that it could complicate American efforts as well. So there is a real serious debate going on as to what Israel should do in this particular situation. As many of you may know, in the last 4 or 5 hours, a major dramatic political development has occurred in which the Foreign Minister, Yvette Lieberman, has decided to disengage his faction from the Likud faction, the Israel Beitenu faction, the Israel Ahom faction, from the Likud faction, as a result of what he calls Prime Minister Netanyahu's hesitation. This is a particularly dramatic development because it could signal a political realignment whereby another party, such as the Labor Party, might come into the coalition, and it could well be that Mr. Lieberman could find himself terminated as foreign minister by Mr. Netanyahu. This is speculation and assessment by my part at this point, but I would pay attention to this development. It is a major political development and could result in a major shift in the political map, even leading to Israel elections in the next 6 to 9 months. This is a reflection of the sense of the major question marks in Israel at the highest levels of the Israeli government as to how to handle this particular situation, with Hamas in Gaza and in the national security challenges that continue in the West Bank. There are several hundred Hamas operatives and representatives, especially in the West Bank, that have been incarcerated or being held in Israel since the kidnapping murder. This has not helped Mr. Abbas. He's also in a very complicated situation, which Israel is very well aware of. Israel at this juncture has taken a policy of wait and see, but not to in any way compromise Mr. Abbas if possible. However, the current situation is to put him in the corner with regard to the Palestinian public. The Hamas has gained in popularity, and Israel knows that if it attacks Gaza now, that will be a major boon to the Hamas's popularity on the Palestinian street. And I would argue it will also increase Hamas's legitimacy in the international community. Hamas's legitimacy increases when it is under attack by Israel, and it decreases, as we saw, when it is not in a situation where it is under counter-terror operation, or it is on the receiving end of a counter-terror operation, but it undertakes acts like the kidnapping murder that we saw in the last week, in which its legitimacy had shrunk enormously in the international community. So Israel is aware of these variables, and from what I understand, the decision will most likely be taken to undertake an operation from the air to intensify the current response, which is primarily an air response. You may well see in the coming hours, if not in the next 24 hours, some limited in and out, so-called in and out operations by the Israel Defense Forces on the ground in order to hit areas, in order to repositories, rather, of weaponry that have substantially been built up since the Defense Pillar operation in 2012. The issue of international legitimacy has become a national security issue of the highest order in Israel, and clearly this has affected Israel's ability to act on all of these fronts. So this is an additional, especially because of the national anguish, one, the political ramifications of acting right now, two, this has become the cognitive public diplomatic aspect of the complicating factors surrounding Israel's situation right now has become a major part of the puzzle that Israel right now is facing. I must say that at this juncture, it is a policy, if I could coin it, of wait and see, or wait and defend, as opposed to forward and attack. And there really is no clear, at this moment, no clear direction as to what military actions the Israeli government is going to take. But clearly, there is a very broad awareness that between Hezbollah and Lebanon, we don't know the source of the rocket fire from Lebanon, but whether it was Salafist or Hezbollah in nature, but with Hezbollah sitting on Israel's northern border from Lebanon, with tens of thousands of Hezbollah operatives in Syria working alongside the Assad regime, opposite ISIS in Syria, as well as ISIS threatening the Jordanian border from the east. There is a clear understanding in the security echelons that this creates another possible front for Israel beyond the three fronts that I mentioned earlier. Tamir Pardo, the head of Israel's Mossad, has mentioned this in a private gathering over Shabbat, in which he argues that the ISIS movement westward, towards Israel via Jordan could create a major national security issue for Israel, and that is also being factored into the current calculations. So all in all, a very sensitive situation, one in which Netanyahu has called requiring tremendous, what he calls achrayut and shikul dat, which in Hebrew, which means responsibility and professional consideration, and one that is not a decision based on just intuition or what they call shooting from the hip. So that's where we stand at this moment. I'd be more than delighted to take questions and comments from our friends in Washington and abroad.
Thank you so much, Dan. That was a very, very excellent and comprehensive analysis of the many, many factors that are facing Israel today, and one certainly has renewed empathy for Prime Minister Netanyahu and his the factors that he has to weigh in the judgment about whether or not to launch a further offensive into Gaza.
Well, first of all, I quite agree with you that there is actually much to be done, and that is holding. It's also holding media and holding government reactions accountable, as well as the United Nations. I would remind all of us that Israel has yet to receive a condemnation from the UN Security Council, the UN Human Rights Council, on the kidnapping murder of the 3 Israeli teens, and yet within hours of the murder of the Palestinian teen in Shuafat, there was a across-the-board condemnation from the United Nations and from Western governments. What we have, though, in this very dangerous moral equivalency between the two can also be seen, and I'm sorry to raise this as an example, but I must share with you that there was considerable concern in Israel regarding the U.S. response to the kidnapping and then the murder of the Israeli teens, in which both the White House and the State Department called for, first of all, it called for both sides to exercise restraint. Now, when you call for both sides to exercise restraint, you're referring to Israel and Hamas. And there's an implicit comparison between the two, and there's a sense in Israel that this was a problematic moral equivalency, and it should be, this is something that should be called out. We had the same thing from the European Union, and there are similar reactions and responses that should be. People should be called to task for making these types of moral comparisons between the free democratic nation state of Israel and its and terror groups that are attacking, assaulting, and threatening the country on all of its borders. That's a tough question. Normally, Israel has not seen in the Bedouin community in the South, particularly, a tendency to join these types of violent demonstrations. If you remember, what we're seeing now in some of the Arab Israeli communities in what they call the Little Triangle up in the north is reminiscent of what we saw in 2000 following the incitement on the Temple Mount by several Arab members of Knesset, as well as the Northern Islamic Alliance, which is headed by Sheikh Raed Salah, who is a partner with the Hamas movement and a collaborator with the Hamas movement in Gaza. We did not see then major moves in the Bedouin community, and I don't believe that we will see today. However, it's a very flammable situation. And if Israel and the Hamas get into a real shooting match, as it were, in an intense exchange in Gaza, anything really is possible, because there is a tremendous amount of incitement. If you watch the 125 or so channels in the Arab and Muslim world, there's a tremendous diet of incitement that goes on, especially during counter-terror operations, and that works to inflame the non-Jewish communities throughout Israel. However, from the past, I can say that I would suspect that the Bedouin community in Israel would not get involved. Well, thank you, William. You point to an essential issue here, which touches upon the internal Palestinian situation. This is a situation that has not been revealed, as I have noticed, to Western audiences, and it's critically important to understand. The kidnapping murder was carried out by a Hamas opposition group in the West Bank that believed that Hamas Gaza was, because of its partnership in the reconciliation government with Fatah, the belief was that, or the charge by Hamas West Bank, is that Hamas Gaza was selling the Palestinian people down the river. Therefore, they wanted to conduct such an operation in order to show that what they call the Mukawama, which is the armed resistance, we know it as terrorism, is that which should be the natural state of affairs in terms of Hamas's leadership of the Palestinian street. It was, on a larger sense, a violent expression of the equally violent race for public opinion between the Fatah and the Hamas. Now, if Israel attacks Gaza with determination, it will weaken Mahmoud Abbas, as it did after 2009 and 2012 as well, because Abbas will be forced to side with the Hamas in order to maintain or improve public opinion to the Fatah, and therefore the sense is that it will destabilize. It will further destabilize the situation in the West Bank, which is already very flammable because of the hundreds of Hamas operatives and affiliates who have been taken, and I might add some members of other terror groups like the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigade, which is known as the Tanzim, who've been taken into for interrogation and incarceration temporarily in Israel. So here you have a situation where sneezing in Gaza, people get colds in the West Bank, and Israel can be viewed as he or she that generated the response on both sides, on both Gaza as well as in the West Bank on the eastern side, on Israel's eastern border. So there's why there's a great sensitivity of the ripple effect of an operation in Gaza. And William, it goes beyond the West Bank. It goes even into the encroachment of ISIS and Salafis towards Jordan. And this is as well as on our northern fronts in Syria and Lebanon. So this is a tinderbox that Israel is well aware of and is now deciding whether it's going to, in any case, go to try to recreate some deterrence and destroy the terror infrastructure in Gaza, regardless of what the security echelons are concerned about as the fallout, both in the West Bank as well as in the north and to the east. Well, there's been two shifts in the last 3.5 weeks on that point. Yes. Following the kidnapping murder by the Hamas partner in this reconciliation government, the clear consensus in Israel, both on the political echelons as well as in the body politic, is Mahmoud Abbas has to choose. Either he's going to choose terror and Hamas, or he's going to choose peace and stability and Israel as a negotiating partner. There is a sense in that assessment that there is no possible way that reconciliation pact can stick, and that there was U.S. pressure, not only Israeli pressure and European pressure, to break up that reconciliation government after the kidnapping murder. Since the horrific crime that was discovered just the other day, or 5 or 6 days ago, in Shuafat, that whole calculation now has been tempered in terms of international perception and politics because of this problem of symmetry. And what happens is there is increasing voices that the peace process then becomes the answer to this perception of tit for tat, which is clearly, if one analyzes it, irrelevant to the problem of terrorism. The failed 9-month attempt by Secretary of State Kerry was those around the process, and observers know, was an abject failure in which the gaps were very, very wide on all the key issues. And so, therefore, the following assessment is being made, and it is my sense that the position of the Israeli government is not to injure Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority, to maintain security cooperation. There is security cooperation, and there was security cooperation in the process leading to the discovery of the Israeli teams after 3 weeks. Let's bear in mind that it was Israel that did 95% of the work, and the Palestinian Authority did cooperate, and they want to continue that cooperation and maintain as much stability via Mahmoud Abbas as possible. One important point here: Israel always looks for addresses. Israel needs addresses. Palestinian Authority in Ramallah is an address. The Hamas in Gaza is an address. The Lebanese government is an address, and the Syrian and Syria's Bashar Assad is an address. Israel is much more comfortable with addresses as opposed to battling networks of terrorists where there is no central address, and where these networks metastasize and contract, from hour to hour. So, therefore, the point of this assessment is to say that yes, there is a clear position in the government that to continue to support the Mahmoud Abbas, but at the same time to say you can't have it both ways. Either you choose Hamas or you choose stability and Western Israeli support. Yeah, there was a recent survey taken in which a strong majority of Israelis don't believe that a two-state for two-people solution is possible at this point. I didn't see in the question, in the actual raw material of the survey, if they modified the question to say ever, meaning a peace deal ever, or certainly a peace deal. They just said, is a peace deal possible today? And you had a very strong majority say no, it is not possible today. And the two more, perhaps equally, if not more important, results of the two surveys that I saw is there's a very strong support in Israel among Israelis, Jewish Israelis, for a united Jerusalem and for continued Israeli presence and sovereignty in the Jordan Valley. And those are two important points to keep in mind. I think that Jordan emphasized the importance of the status quo in Jerusalem and the Jordan Valley, and that's a point that has to be made clear going forward. If there are any future attempts at some sort of diplomatic approach. What is being talked about in Israel is a regional approach to peacemaking, because Egypt, which has become a very strong counterterrorism partner for Israel, especially in its relentless efforts to smoke out terrorists in the Sinai, as well as keep the Hamas in check in Gaza, and Jordan have been very clear about what their national interests are. And those national interests, as well as the also interests in the Gulf and Saudi Arabia, those are under the radar, but still understood that if there's to be any sort of settlement with the Palestinians, that it would include some of the larger players, Jordan and Egypt for sure, which they would call the neighbors approach, or even some of the larger Gulf states, even some of the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia. So I think what the kidnapping murder of the three Israeli teams signaled, it de facto is the end of what we know as the Oslo process, notwithstanding the current division of the territory east of the 1967 line as areas A, B, and C. But notwithstanding that, there's been increasing voices also on the government level, in the parliament, in the Knesset, as well as in the think tank world, for a regional approach. And a regional approach is really the only way to approach any kind of possible diplomatic outcome. But what is being talked about now really is conflict management with the Palestinian Authority. The situation of the Palestinian Authority in terms of unemployment is very reasonable at 13-14% compared to Gaza, which is in the 30s and has been as high as the 60s. So everybody's really talking about maintenance and conflict management as opposed to solutions when it comes to the Palestinian issue in the West Bank, and it's really continuing to fight terror with regard to operations that we saw Hamas in the West Bank as well as Hamas in Gaza right now.